We're going to go now to Sarah and Alex, who are both working with different models of how to actively manage forests. Because I'm going to be the first to admit, I like wood. As a forest activist, as a climate activist, I still love wood. I want to live in a wood house. I want to build wood things. I want to be surrounded in an environment with wood. And there is a way to have that and still have your forest be a forest. And so I'm really excited to introduce Sarah Deumling, who I've heard of for so many years as one of the people in Oregon who is managing a forest for both ecology and economy. So Sarah owns and manages the Zena Forest, which is a 1,300-acre forest in the Willamette Valley, and been doing that for 3 decades. There's something like that. Since 1984, Zena is a mixed hardwood and conifer forest containing several endangered habitats, including oak savanna and oak woodland. And Zena Forest Products manufactures durable, solid hardwood flooring, as well as lumber for cabinet and furniture making. So Sarah is well known in the carbon forest climate world for managing a forest that uses longer growing cycles and selective harvests to maximize carbon sequestration on her land. And she's going to talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice, and then we'll be joined after, I'll just introduce him next, by Alice Harris, who is zooming in from Bellingham. And we'll be talking about community forestry, which is something that they're leaning into a lot more in Washington than we are in Oregon, and I'm really excited to hear about. So Alex used to be here. Some of you might know him from his days, yes, with Oregon Wild. We miss him very much, but he's doing awesome things up in Washington. He went to graduate school at Western and focused research on different models of community forestry, evaluating the challenges and opportunities of each model. And he currently works as the land and water policy manager for Bellingham-based conservation group Resources for Sustainable Communities, and lives on a farm near Acme, Washington. He's going to discuss the models of community forestry, which offer an alternative approach to the industrial logging paradigm that dominates the landscape. So between them, we'll really be saying, how can we manage the forest in a way where the forest is still there for the animals, for the communities, and for the foresters? Thanks, Sarah.
If you can't hear me, let me know. Some people have said my voice is waning along with other things up here. I was going to also say that I do much better talking when I'm walking through my forest on a tour than in places like this. And if you think a Mitch McConnell moment's coming on, don't worry. It's just I lose my train of thought sometimes. And like Chuck, I will tell you what I do and we do, but I have so many places where I'm liable to go on a tangent and which would really be fodder for another conversation. But looking at the forests over profit, I thought we're the perfect people to talk because for almost 40 years we've been putting the forest first and the forest ecosystem first, and we're still trying to make a profit. So we definitely have our forests over profit, but it's not always sustainable forever that way. So that's kind of a little background statement to everything else I'm going to say. A little bit of part of what trained me was a German concept that's called naturgemäße Waldwirtschaft, which means nature-based forestry. It means working with all those natural processes in a forest ecosystem rather than saying, phooey, quick harvest, quick buck. And it has to do with all sorts of things. I won't go there. We have 1,300 acres. The description of our forest, a brief one, is that it runs along the top of the Eola Hills, which is west of Salem and south of Amity. And we're kind of surrounded by vineyards and hazelnut plantations, which have helped to diminish the remaining oak in the Willamette Valley. I am no good at writing speeches. I wrote 2 in the last couple of days and threw them both away. And so I wanted to just tell you stories, but here's a picture. The Oregon forests are owned by the federal government, lots of them. By the state government, a very small part that's mostly in Clatsop and Tillamook counties that some of you know too well. Tribes, not so much, but a little more all the time. And then there's the community forests, which are new and coming and a small, and then there's private forests, and that's a lot. And Chuck was talking a lot, all these things are private forests. It doesn't look private, REIT and TIMO, but it is. And of the private forests, 56% are these big industrial forests. Whoops, no hands. 56% are the big industrial forests, and 44% are family forest landowners who own less than 5,000 acres. And we belong in that group. And I am myself and my children, and children-in-law and so forth, grandchildren. And those family forest lands are managed for better or worse in a whole spectrum of ways of management. And a very small percentage of them are managed by people who try to make their living off of them. And my little anecdote for that is that I was at a meeting a few years ago about forest taxes, which is always an interesting topic to us who are trying to make a profit. And there were maybe 35 or 40 people in the room, and the speaker said, "How many of you make your living off of the forest?" One hand went up. So it's a lot of people who've inherited the land and have other jobs. It's a lot of independently wealthy people. It's a lot of retired people, some from California, that have made a lot of money and come up and bought forest land. And some of them do a remarkably wonderful job of taking care of those forests. And they can afford to do things that we can't afford to do. So our bottom line is that we would like to make a living and have health insurance and especially treat our employees right. And so this goes back to our initial goal, our interim goal, and our goal now is to be an example that an ecologically healthy forest and an economically viable forest are actually the same or should be the same in the long run. And often right now, whatever you get has been destroyed and or damaged in many ways by our society. But the value of that forest should be greater than the value of an industrial forest for the perpetuity. And one thing we have to help us with that is the fact that we have, that maybe it's more of an indication, there's a conservation easement on the Zena Forest and on 2 neighboring forests held by Bonneville Power, who has mitigation obligations because of all the habitat their dams and power lines have destroyed. And in the Willamette Valley, the most threatened habitat is oak. And we were in the lucky position, or not. The timber people thought we were not in the lucky position, but we have lots of oak. We probably are 50% hardwood and 50% conifer. And the central Willamette Valley is the center of Oregon white oak. And there's about, I think there's varying categories and descriptions, but between 2 and 5% of the oak remaining that was here when Lewis and Clark came. So goal number 2 is to help maintain and increase the oak in the Willamette Valley and keep it healthy. So let's see. So the next thing I would like to say is trying in a nutshell to say how our management in very broad terms is different than the industrial management. And I used to say, when we were still truer to our values than we are today, we've broken some of these rules. No CCC, and the 3 C's were no clear cuts, no chemicals, and no compaction. And I could give a speech on each of those probably, but the no clear cuts is pretty obvious. I will say probably with each of these that single tree selection, which is what we've practiced for many years, is far more expensive than a clear cut. But I was wondering today if I was going to be in a room full of people who thought we shouldn't cut trees. And I don't know, and I don't know my audience. So forgive me if I tell you lots of things you know, but don't forgive me if I tell you things you don't like. But for me, since we have generally a complex mixed forest that has almost all the native tree species that belong in the Willamette Valley, and I will say our valley forest, number one, it's the largest remaining contiguous section of forest in the Willamette Valley, not in the foothills on either side, but in the valley. And it's a different forest. It's an ecologically different system. And it has lots of maple and lots of oak, and it has ash along the streams instead of alder, which is when you get to the Coast Range. And so our theory is that we look at any group of trees where we think it's so crowded that we need to take something out. And we know as a basis that every acre or every square meter of forest floor can support a certain amount of organic matter in the form of trees or shrubbery or ground cover, whatever it is. And after that, you might have 1,000 trees per acre, or you might have 20 trees per acre. And somewhere in between there's going to be too many for them to become big and healthy, and they will start to die. So we like to, since we do have a mill and we do make wood products, we like to look at that group of trees and see which tree has the best potential to become the Germans that I know from whom I learned forestry call it the eternity tree, the tree that might stand there forever or until it dies, or might be the best possible tree, giving us a lot of wood products that would hold carbon for hundreds of years if it's an oak, and a long time if it's a fir or maple or whatever. And so then we would look for the competitor and take the strongest competitor that would give that crown of that special eternity tree light so it can keep growing. Because as soon as the crowns touch, the trees slow down a lot growing, and the more they're crowded, the less they grow. So we would rather have one beautiful tree in 100 years than we would have 6 struggling trees. So that's kind of the system that we use to choose a tree. We also know, because we've been so lucky to live there for so long, just by looking at what's growing on the ground and the slope and the aspect, we know which trees will survive best there. And there's spots in the forest where maple and fir will still do fine. There's spots in the forest where the maple and the fir are struggling, and the oaks and the madrones and maybe incense cedar do fine. Oh gosh. Well, I'll tell you the most important things. This is a story about oak. Darn. When I first took over from my husband in 1996, when he passed away, my first logger, who turned out to be a gem, but very early on, I caught him one day with his chainsaw going into an oak tree because it was in the way of the fir I'd marked to cut. And I said, "No, Dave, you can't do that." And then I explained why we thought oak was important. And he was sorry and learned, and he worked with us just great for years. But he said, "We just threw those down the canyon." So for the history of forestry in the Willamette Valley, oak and maple and other hardwoods have been thrown down the canyon because there was no market. There was no infrastructure. It could be firewood, or it could just stay in the canyon and it would be replanted to fir. So there's lots to say about why we're trying to protect the oak resource by giving it a value. And our way of giving it a value is to pay a high premium for people who are thinning oak that they plan to keep and manage, and to pay much less to the many conversion projects where they want to turn it into just fir, or they want to turn it into agriculture or housing or something like that. So it gives us a chance to interface with a lot of people and kind of be missionaries for oak. And the message I most want to leave you with is the forest gives us so many values, and you know them all: water, air, soil, biodiversity, carbon storage, on and on and on. And timber. How many do we get paid for? Boards. If we don't have a planet we can live on, a few more boards isn't going to help us. That's fine. 2 small postscripts. One, I've spoken to many timber industry people over the years. No one has ever objected to our management. They only say it won't pencil. This is from the opposite view of Chuck, who I appreciate greatly. But we need in Oregon to find ways to recognize the fact that some of us practice forestry differently and that there's a value to all of you, not me. I get to breathe forest air every day. Everybody benefits from a good way of practicing forestry. And I'd like to give you lots of things, but potentially we could tax water just a little bit. A small tax on a unit of water in public use. There are a lot of other things. We need to advocate for the fact that there's a difference between industrial forestry and our forestry. And if we're not supported, I have to give the land back to the tribes. Yep. The last thing, if any of you are at all interested in continuing the conversation, we do welcome you.
Thank you, Sarah. And we'll have time for questions and conversations with both Sarah and Alex afterwards. So now we're going to go to Alex Harris. Alex, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for that. My name is Alex Harris. I am from Oregon. I now live in Whatcom County, which is the last county before British Columbia in northern Washington. And I'm going to be presenting about community forests as I researched them for my graduate research. I conducted graduate research for 2 years at Western Washington University in Bellingham, and I finished that project about a year and a half ago. So I have adapted my thesis work for today's presentation, assuming that most of you are pretty familiar with chemos and REITs and kind of the current state of industrial forest practices in Western Cascadia. If you're interested in learning more about any of the things I talk about, I recommend you check out my thesis work. I'll make a plug for it at the end of the presentation as well, but there's 2 papers that dive into this in much greater detail. I have lots of maps and charts and tables that break down a lot of this information. So if you are interested in the next layer, I'll show you how to find my research at the end. So here's what I'll be going over. I'll be telling you a little bit more about the Nooksack watershed, which is the watershed that I live in. The Stewart Mountain Community Forest, which is this innovative project that we are developing here in Whatcom County. I'll give you case examples of other community forests, and then I'll end with some conclusions. So starting with the Nooksack watershed, this is the furthest north watershed in northwest Washington. In fact, some parts of the watershed actually bleed into British Columbia. To zoom in on that watershed, you see Bellingham here on the western side of the watershed. The Nooksack River drains into Bellingham Bay. And the Nooksack is known for its 3 forks. If anyone's ever been to Mount Baker or up into the North Cascades, you may have gone up the North Fork Highway. There's also the Middle Fork and the South Fork. And today I'll be talking about the South Fork, which is where I live. I live near the town of Acme, which is here in the South Fork Nooksack River Valley. And the South Fork of all of the forks is the most threatened by climate change, by land uses, forestry, and agriculture. So it's the focus of a lot of conservation efforts. The other reason it's a focus of conservation efforts is that we have all 5 species of salmon in our watershed, as well as steelhead, cutthroat trout, rainbow trout, bull trout, mountain whitefish, and other fish. Can anyone guess what kind of fish this is? And Brenna might have to tell me if anyone's guessed. This is Chinook. So if you don't know a lot about Chinook salmon, these are the biggest of our fish in the Pacific Northwest. And historically, they've been the most important for indigenous people in this area. There are a lot of reasons. I could go into a lot of reasons why Chinook are so important economically and culturally. Just know that they are beautiful, magnificent marine animals that migrate up our rivers. In this case, this is footage from the South Fork, actually just about a quarter mile from where I live. These fish are very endangered, and they're very important commercially, culturally, spiritually to a lot of the people who live here. So there's been a lot of focus on restoring fish throughout the Northwest. I don't need to get into a lot of detail here. This is a similar story in Oregon. Just to give you some context, there used to be about 1,400 different populations, different runs in the Pacific Northwest. About a third of those have already become extinct. So instead of thinking of species going extinct, think of local populations, runs going extinct, and the term is extirpated. So of the remaining runs, the numbers of those runs in terms of how many fish are still around is roughly 5% of their historic levels. That's wild salmon. Most salmon in Pacific Northwest rivers today are hatchery fish. And there are a lot of debates about hatcheries. I will not be getting into those. I just wanted to give you some context for where salmon are at in the Northwest. Zooming back in onto the onto the South Fork. The South Fork Nooksack River is still home to these fish, but there are 3 major impairments that are holding them back. The first is temperature. So the water is too warm. The second is turbidity. There's too much suspended sediment in the river. And the third is low summer stream flow. There's just not enough water flowing in late summer. And there are a lot of reasons for those 3 impairments, but industrial forestry has played a particularly strong role in contributing to those watershed impairments. Industrial logging is the dominant land use in the South Fork watershed. There's a long history and legacy of commercial logging in this watershed. And several analyses from the feds and the tribe here, the Nooksack tribe, have concluded that industrial logging is likely the primary driver of these water quality impairments. And there's also research that's been conducted the last few years that is hypothesizing, it's not published research yet, but it's hypothesizing that industrial logging is actually leading to diminished summer stream flows. To give you a map of the watershed, you can see the different land uses here. I won't get into all the detail, but yellow is ag, so that's where most of the people live in the watershed, and that's where agriculture takes place. Pretty much the rest of the watershed is forestry. Out here on the eastern side, in the higher elevations, is federal land. That's the green. The light green here is commercial forestry, so that's private industrial timberland. And then the blue is the Department of Natural Resources. They manage their lands a lot better than private timberlands, but they're still managing for return on investment, maximizing board feet to to maximize revenue, which then goes to trust beneficiaries. So this is a good snapshot of how industrial logging characterizes the majority of the footprint of this watershed. To give you another snapshot of what that looks like, over the past 25 years, and this actually hasn't been updated to reflect this year's timber sales, but here are the timber sales from the past 25 years. And you can see extensive parts of this watershed have been harvested. Not all of these are clear cuts, but the vast majority of these are. So you can get an idea of the cumulative impacts over space and over time. When clear cutting takes place at this scale, it contributes to some of these watershed problems. Another way of looking at it is satellite time lapses. I love these because they actually show how forests are managed over space and over time. Human beings usually don't look at land from this perspective. This is a bird's eye view that's zooming through 20 years of forestry. So this gives us a unique perspective of what the landscape sees. We might not see it. We might just see one clear cut at a time, and then they replant and we think it's all good, right? But the landscape sees this. This is Stewart Mountain, which I'll be telling you a little bit more about. I live actually at the bottom of this frame. So these clear cuts are where I like to go hike and bike, and they're now plantations. So I'll quickly go through this since this is probably something that most of you already know about. There is research from 3 different experimental forests throughout Oregon that has compiled 60 years of data. This is long-term ecological research, observations that have basically looked at paired watersheds, where one watershed is logged according to the rules and replanted according to standard practices, and the other adjacent watershed is unlogged. And they've repeated this in various locations throughout Oregon. And all of these research sites have found roughly the same thing, which is very significant, that logging and replanting reduce summer stream flow in the creeks and the rivers by 50% when compared to adjacent unlogged watersheds. Notably, these diminished stream flows persisted for decades. So this wasn't like it just happened one year and then it recovered. These reduced stream flows actually stayed around for numerous decades. We can safely conclude that clear cutting today and replanting monoculture tree plantations is leading to less water into the late 21st century. And I don't need to preach about climate change to any of you. I'm sure every single one of you is at this conference because you care about climate change. We've all seen what the climate is projected to do in the late 21st century. And one of the most notable climate impacts in our corner of the world is the effects on hydrology. We're going to see higher peak flows in the winter, bigger flood events, flashier hydrograph. That's already happening. We're going to see more of that. And then the summer flows will be lower and lower. And summer, of course, is when farmers need water the most, is when fish need water the most, and climate change will just be making that worse. So how we manage our forests today can either exacerbate those climate impacts, or it can mitigate some of those impacts and actually make us more resilient to climate change. That's where ecological forestry comes in. I won't spend a ton of time on this. Ecological forestry is a very complicated topic, but I'll give you a snapshot of ecological forestry. The general idea is to manage a forest as an ecosystem instead of managing it as a crop. So notably, when you talk to foresters today, loggers, foresters, there is a certain language, a certain mindset of managing forests as a crop, as tree farms. And they talk about productivity, they talk about getting rid of their weeds, which are oftentimes native shrubs and trees, and trying to most productively develop a forest to 35 to 45 years. and harvest it at that time. A lot like how farmers look at their crop, say a crop report. Ecological foresters are looking at a forest as an ecosystem and managing it accordingly. Ecological forestry, a tenet of this model is to promote multiple uses and objectives. So instead of harvesting timber and replanting solely for the purpose of maximizing return on investment, ecological foresters are actually thinking about other things beyond what the bare minimum requirements are by law. They're also thinking about wildlife habitat and watershed health and carbon storage, etc. There's an emphasis in ecological forestry on structural complexity and biodiversity. So structural complexity is the mix of tree sizes and ages throughout a stand. You'll have large trees, you'll have young, small trees, and some trees in the mid-story. You'll also have some horizontal diversity, so it's not all a uniform, even stand, but instead you'll have some areas that are more gappy and some areas that are skips, these kind of denser stands. And you'll have a mix of species. You won't just have Douglas fir, you'll also have the other conifers, hemlock and cedar, grand fir. If you're in Oregon, you can start playing around with ponderosa and Doug fir combinations. There are so many possibilities for conifer, forests. But then you also can bring in broadleaf trees like maples and alders. You can also experiment with shrub communities that are settling in gaps in the canopy. And of course, this kind of structural complexity and biodiversity is exactly what is missing on the landscape. It's what European settlers found when they came here. It was a landscape carved by fire and through long periods of developing. There were no clear cuts. There were no plantations. Notably, most of our lowland forests today are plantations, and they are very homogeneous and simple. Another tenet of ecological forestry is frequent entry, variable density thinning, and significant retention. I don't have a ton of time to get into this, but if you're interested in, great, my screen is blurring this. This is a book that you're not going to be able to see on screen, but it's called Ecological Forest Management. It's by Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, and Deb Johnson. These are the founding members of the concept of ecological forestry. And if you're interested in learning more, this book is dense and full of amazing information. So I highly recommend it. Okay, so with that primer on the Nooksack watershed and ecological forestry, let me just zoom through to the most important stuff. We are advancing an ecological forestry pilot project here in the Nooksack watershed. Bellingham is here on the far left side of the screen. I actually live right here, so adjacent to this yellow outline, which is the proposed Stewart Mountain Community Forest. And the goal is to buy this TIMO timberland and convert it into an ecological forestry project that's owned by the local community and managed for numerous benefits. So the total acreage is about 5,500 acres. The first 500 acres have already been acquired. The partners are Whatcom County, the Nooksack Tribe, Whatcom Land Trust, and Evergreen Land Trust. And the basic primary objective is to restore the South Fork watershed through improved forest practices. So there are other objectives as well, because this is ecological forestry. One of those is economic development, so promoting jobs in the woods and wood production, sustainable wood production, expanding recreation access, and bolstering community autonomy. So my graduate research was focused on which model of community forestry was best suited for Stewart Mountain. And in order to answer that question, I looked at these different characteristics. Who owns the forest? How is it governed? And how is it managed? And I went through all the case examples in the Pacific Northwest. Here's a snapshot of some of those community forests. You can see Washington has a lot more than Oregon. You can also see on this chart the different ownerships. Some of these are cities, some of them are counties, some of them are nonprofits, tribes. The DNR, State Department of Natural Resources, actually owns 2 community forests. Let's see, those are the main types. And here's a map of those same community forests. Like I said, you can check out my graduate research to look at these charts and maps in greater detail, but you can see the state of Washington has a lot more community forests than Oregon. Here's zoomed in, listing those out. My 3 case examples that I focused on were these 3 here, and I'll quickly go through these just so you can get a snapshot of what a community forest looks like. Perhaps the most interesting community forest, in my opinion, is the Nisqually Community Forest. It's about 2,800 acres, but the Nisqually tribe actually just acquired 1,200 acres that's adjacent. So it's in total something like 4,000 acres of contiguous land that will be managed as a community forest using ecological forestry practices. It's in the Nisqually watershed, and the focus is salmon recovery and sustainable forestry. A really cool model of working with various stakeholders as well as the Nisqually tribe to own and govern and manage this land. And if you want to learn more about this model, check out my graduate research. Here is a map. You can see Mount Rainier National Park on the east side. There's Nisqually Community Forest in blue. The land trust owns that parcel in orange, and then the tribe is bought that 1,200 acres in that light green. So you can see there's this block of land that's going to be stewarded as an ecological forestry pilot. The next case example is the Teanaway. This forest is giant, 50,000 acres. If you don't know how big that is, it's big. The legislature allocated $100 million in one fell swoop to buy this from investors and make sure it wasn't developed. It was a really cool project, really great history. It's in the Upper Yakima watershed, lots of really great goals. It's owned by the state and managed by the Department of Natural Resources, and they work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife to restore the forest. And there's a really complex and awesome governance structure. Here's a map of that. There's I-90. This is east of Seattle, north of Plano, if you know the area. The last case example I'll show you is the Nason Ridge Community Forest, which is 3,700 acres. It's near Lake Wenatchee, and it has various goals relating to watershed health, recreation, and sustainable forestry. This is owned by a county, and there's a unique governance structure that they're forming. They just acquired the land within the last year, so there's still a lot of work for them to do. And here's a map of that community forest. So zooming through some of my conclusions, the promises of community forestry are the following. The opportunity to apply ecological forestry at scale. It's an alternative to this false dichotomy of industrial logging versus lock it up conservation. There is a middle ground. There are so many different ways to manage a forest to promote economic and environmental goals. It also is an opportunity to disrupt investor-driven forestry. So a lot of TIMOs and REITs are selling their land right now, which is why this conference is happening. And there's a question about who is going to own the forest when they sell it. Will it be another TIMO, or will it be another REIT? Or is this an opportunity to actually buy up this forest land? And this itself has been one of the main impetuses of community forestry in the Northwest. Community-led stewardship is another, I would say, perk of this approach. It's an opportunity to involve the community in managing forests towards community objectives. It's also an opportunity to experiment and adapt. There are no two community forests that are identical. There are so many different models to choose from. Some of the challenges I'll highlight before I'll conclude. There is pretty significant opposition from some timber interests that are worried that this is the new model and that more and more community forests will buy up land and manage it for numerous benefits instead of maximizing short-term timber production. So that's a real thing. Conservation groups are pretty wary to criticize industrial logging when they're engaging in these projects. Timberland's expensive, so acquisition relies on grants. And the ongoing management costs can be pretty significant, especially in these areas where industrial logging companies have degraded the land and then they run away from it. So you need to generate enough revenue in order to pay for roads and other management costs. So to learn more, just Google my graduate research. If you just Google community forestry, Alexander Harris, Nooksack, it will be the first thing that comes up. You can also look at our Future Forest campaign. The organization I work for, we launched this campaign about a year ago, and we are producing videos and maps and working on the local level to move this kind of forestry forward. We also produced a video with Jerry Franklin, which is about 10 minutes long, and it goes into ecological forestry in greater depth. So if you're interested in that topic, just Google Jerry Franklin on YouTube, and this is the first video that will show up. So with that, sorry I went a little over. I would love to answer questions if there are any.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. We do have time for just a little bit, I mean, not really, but we're going to make time for a little bit of conversation with Sarah and Alex. Sarah, can you come on back up real quick? And also, like I said, we will capture all that information that Alex just shared, and if you signed in yesterday or today, you will receive that. You can also Google it, that was great, but we'll try and get that to you in an easy format. So do we have a couple in the back? Peter.
Sarah and Alex, thank you. Those are both great. And Sarah, tell us what you most want or need from all of us in society to help your model be as successful as you know it can be.
Into the mic.
Thanks, old friend. Well, advocacy to make it, help us make it work. And that could come in the form of helping your legislators understand how important forests are and how there are different ways to do forests. And the other thing is buy some flooring. Or go to the airport and take a look at our floors. They're the floors for the new airport. So we do have products that will last through your great-grandchildren's lifetime. No good. Anyway.
Yes, in the back. Scott?
Yeah, thank you, Alexander. Just some questions about details on jobs available to sustainable forestry versus industrial logging.
The question, Alex, I'm not sure if you heard, was what's the comparison of jobs in sustainable forestry to the amount of people employed, like per board foot, do you mean in industrial logging?
Right. So that's a good question. You know, one of the challenges with answering that question is this model of forestry has yet to be applied at significant scale to really understand how it kind of scales up economically for jobs and for board feet. That being said, ecological forest practices are far more labor intensive. They require more planning, and the foresters who lay these out are more engaged in really understanding the forest, flagging what is going to be cut and what's not. And then just from a harvesting perspective, it's trickier to delicately come into a forest and select certain trees to take and others to leave. It's a lot more efficient to clear cut and replant. So from a labor perspective, it's more labor intensive. That does mean it's less profitable. But the cool thing about community forests is that usually their goal is not to generate revenue. It's to promote management that covers the costs of that management. So it's kind of a closed loop. You're paying for the roads, you're paying for the contractors, but you're not trying to maximize return on investment or revenue for beneficiaries. The goal is just for it to be self-sustained. So you're have a little more elbow room to support that more labor-intensive approach?
I can say that our goals are the same. Our goals are the same in that respect. All we want to do is live and pay our employees right.
Yes, has extension helped you much? Because there used to be a small woodlot extension service or agents, and can you ask more of them, especially in terms of the threats to oak right now and the threats to ash and other trees?
My very snotty, immodest opinion is that they are decades behind the times. Sorry. They're very nice people, and I have friends among them, but they're not a help to me. Or rarely, I should say.
So that's what we can be advocates too.
They need to get with the program before we fall off the cliff.
Thank you.
Time for a couple more questions.
Sarah, you and I were talking earlier about that certification that shows that you're doing ecological forestry. What was that called?
Can I defer to Peter?
SSC or something like that?
Forest Stewardship Council certification.
Yeah, so so like Sarah's idea that we go out and buy some lumber, which some boards that I hope I can do for a house one day. If I wanted to select from sellers who have that certification, is it present on the, like how does the consumer know they're buying wood that's been sustainably forested?
So you have, can I answer that, Sarah?
Please.
You have two choices. One is to find who are those producers, like Zena or Iowa Wood or others, and you go directly to them, like going to your farmer's market and buying a cucumber. Another help is Sustainable Northwest Wood in southeast Woodland. Is a link that helps connect people.
But so if I'm in Lowe's, it's not going to be like flagged on their sign.
Sometimes it will be, but normally it won't.
Okay.
The FSC is far from perfect, but it's the best we've got. And another thing on the punch list is to reform and improve it.
Thank you. I have one more question. I thought that the oaks, the white oaks, were an endangered or threatened species. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're very, very, very diminished.
And aren't there some wildlife that are endangered that reside in wood? Like, my bottom line question is, there funds available to people who are foresting with endangered and critical species in mind?
There are cost share funds through the federal government. And actually, right now, thanks to the Biden administration's IRA thing, there are pots of money out there to help us do oak restoration. And the oak habitat in the Willamette Valley is by far the richest and most diverse and the most threatened in the valley. So we're hopeful. In November, we might get a pot of money to do some good things.
Thank you. We are going to have to end, but Sarah will be here all day. You can talk to her. Alex, we're going to have to say goodbye, and thank you so much. Yeah. It's so good to see you. We miss you here in Oregon. And yeah, we really, really appreciate you coming down today.
Yeah, keep up the conversation. It's super important.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you so much, Sarah.